Hello and welcome to #DisruptionDialogues, a Markets and Markets podcast series for growth-minded strategy, market intelligence, and competitive intelligence professionals. Today our host Pranjal Sharma is in discussion with Giovanni Bertolino, Head of E-Mobility USA and Canada at Enel X.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of Disruption Dialogues. I'm Pranjal Sharma. I'm an author based in New Delhi and I'm going to be in discussion with Giovanni Bertolino. Thanks, Giovanni, for joining us today.
Thank you, Pranjal, for having me.
So we're going to be discussing about why utilities need to care about EV charging and how it will impact not just the utilities, but really all of us, because that's the key issue about electric vehicles. Giovanni, give us a sense of the kind of work that you have been doing. It's absolutely critical that the entire ecosystem, from utilities to car makers to all of us as users in commercial spaces, public transport, everybody comes together for this. Where are we at this point?
Yeah, I think we are at an inflection point. We're going to see a huge acceleration in adoption of EVs and investments at all different levels in the industry to support this transition. Utilities have a key role to play there, and Enel is at the forefront of that. I mean, Enel over the last 10 years have been investing more and more in making sure that the electricity that flows in the grid is more and more renewable. And we have a commitment to go to 100% renewable over the next 20 years. But also, we've seen that making electricity renewable is not just enough. We want to look at all the energy consumptions, and transportation is the second largest sector in terms of energy consumption and global emission of CO2. So that's why we started investing also in supporting electrification of transportation. And we're seeing the next decade, so until 2030, we named that the decade of electrification, because we want to push forward the electrification of transportation. We're going to start also looking out to convert all other energy uses to electricity. Why we're doing that? Because, with investment in renewables and renewables becoming cheaper and cheaper, we can, address two issues. We can address the global impact of carbon emissions and local pollution. And the technology now is there to support that transition. And we are going to address that with technologies that will make that transition smoother and faster, making sure that the investments needed to support all this additional electricity load on the grid is manageable. So that's really the angle for utilities. How can we make sure that we can convert very quickly the entire fleet of vehicles, whether they are residential or medium and heavy duty public transportation vehicles, to electric? And how can we deliver all that energy, keeping investments on the grid as low as possible, so that drivers can benefit from lower costs for powering their vehicles? I mean, when you transition to EV, you're going to have still a higher upfront cost, because an EV is still a bit more expensive because of the batteries that you need to have, but the running cost will be much lower. So if we can keep that cost of electricity low, that will make the transition easier, and both for drivers and for ratepayers. We will not have to fund expensive upgrades in the grid. And we're focusing on smart charging infrastructure exactly to address that issue.
It's interesting, Giovanni, our lives are going to change. It was, last few years, we keep chasing and looking for charging points for our mobile phones. And now we have to make sure that we don't have to, keep searching for a charging point for our cars in the future. So we got to have, charging points at easy access levels. Isn't that the core of the whole concept?
Absolutely. I think we're going to see more and more EVs like our phones. And actually, to that point, the most, convenient way to charge your EV is charging at home. And that's probably one of the core things that we do is providing an easy, affordable, but smart residential charging solutions. And whoever has ability to have access to a place where to install a charger will find the experience of, plugging the vehicle at night and charging overnight, or wherever the car is idle, will be the easiest and cheapest way to charge its vehicle. Of course, there are big differences, in different regions of the world. There are regions of the world there where the percentage of households who have access to, a garage or a parking lot where they can install a charger is much higher, like United States, for instance. There are other regions of the world where that is not really the case. And there are solutions for condos, of course, but there are even many places where people just park their car on the street. They don't have a dedicated space. And in that case, public charging will be critical to make sure that there is enough infrastructure. But public charging can be it's not just public charging, because I think will be important also having charging options at the workplace or every location where people can have their car parked for a meaningful amount of time. So that they can have options to connect the car, and that will bring a twofold benefit. On one side, of course, having the infrastructure will ease the adoption. People will not be concerned about where do I charge my car, how do I make sure that I can get whatever I want every time I want. But also, the more charging points are available, the more cars will be connected, and the more that will benefit the grid actually, because the longer the cars are connected, the more flexibility utilities will have on delivering those electrons to vehicles at different times of the day. This will help ease the strain on the grid as the actual charging load can be spread over multiple hours, and will also help integrate more renewables onto the grid. If instead of charging everyone at night, many cars or vehicles will be able to charge during the day, they will be able to absorb solar energy, for instance. So there are multiple benefits, and it's key to have the widest and most reachable infrastructure as possible.
Giovanni, you talked about technologies. So what are the breakthrough technologies that are available or are developing, and the ones maybe that you are working on, which will enable this? Because from grid management to ensuring that you have the distribution of power to so many new access points is really a huge shift in the way power is delivered, generated, and consumed.
Yeah, for the time being, we're focusing on conventional, I would say. It's not conventional because everything is new, but conventional way of delivering charge to vehicles. So we're not into wireless charging or battery swaps. We're focusing on standard, plugging your vehicle to a device which is able to control the charging experience. And the device can be in alternate current or in direct current. The direct current, of course, allows for high power charging and fast charging. Alternate current allows for a good speed of charging, which is perfect for residential or workplace locations. And also in some case for public charging where a vehicle can stay put for a number of hours. Think of a parking lot at a transit hub, for instance. The technology of the hardware per se might be simple. What is key is, in our view, is that these chargers need to be connected, needs to be devices that can be remotely monitored and controlled. Why is that? Because we need to understand in real time what are the consumption patterns on the grid so that we can accordingly manage the grid. We want to understand what are the consumption patterns of the drivers so that as utilities, we can design tariff schemes or incentive schemes to drive behaviors so that it is more convenient to charge where there is less load on the grid or when there is more renewable energy on the grid, for instance. Or even more, we can control actively the charging experience so that whenever there is an excess of load on the grid, we can curtail the charging from vehicles to avoid, blackouts or avoiding, additional investments in increasing the capacity of the grid. Again, in your usual, driving, you really need to charge your vehicle 1 or 2 hours per day in AC, assuming that you drive, 40, 50, 60 miles per day. If it's just 2 hours per day of charging, and you can spread the charging over multiple hours, assuming the cars can be connected to for many hours to a charging point, as I was suggesting before, that is a huge source of flexibility for utility. The technology behind that, strong integration between hardware and software, enabling utilities to manage these, large source, potentially very large source of, demand response, will be critical to, as I said, make a very viable to adopt as many EVs and integrate as many EVs to the grid as possible and as fast as possible.
Giovanni, you talk about, the big effort has to be from the utilities. Do you see that the utilities will have to change the way that they work, change their systems, processes, and technologies to be able to deliver this huge demand, which is likely to grow very fast?
I think more than a challenge is a huge opportunity for utilities. It's a huge opportunity because utilities can see the demand of electricity grow significantly. And this will help, of course, sustain their business, but ultimately will help their ratepayers because, the cost of a grid is a fixed cost that gets divided across, the number of users and the amount of kilowatt hours that are being delivered. So the more demand on the grid, the lower will be the cost of that grid for the customer base. So for utilities, it's a huge opportunity to increase the perceived value of their business and to provide additional services and benefits to their customers. And utilities, the barriers for utilities to get into this business are reasonably low because there are players like us, like Enel, who are partnering with utilities, supporting their business model with our technology. In the US, for instance, where we are not a utility, we are providing a service. We're partnering with over 40 utilities, participating in over 130 utility programs, where with our technology, we are enabling utilities, giving them insight into customers' behaviors in charging partners, helping utilities design tariffs, time of use rates, and implementing demand response programs with the load of chargers. Utilities will have an important role in supporting this transition, and will also participate for sure in the investment because utilities have the opportunity to invest directly in the build out of this infrastructure. I mean, there are nuances because it depends on the specific regulation, what utilities are allowed to do or not allowed to use. There are in various jurisdictions there can be differences, but in many cases utilities are getting approved in important investment programs from their public utility commissions to pour money into this effort of electrification. And money coming from utilities will complement the money and investments coming from, federal governments and local governments and private investors in building an EV charging infrastructure for public charging, for fleet, and for end users.
And a big part of this, Giovanni, is also public transport infrastructure because the demand for that would be much higher. I mean, some cities have electric trams and suburban metros, but if we have to move almost everything into EV or electric charging mode, then I think there is also a lot of investment from a city perspective, right? So utilities will have to work with cities. Are there any, how do you see this developing in the next few years?
A lot of cities are setting ambitious targets for decarbonization, and electrification of transportation has a key benefit for cities because it will materially reduce local pollution. So the cities should be the first stakeholder with a strong interest in pursuing electrification of transportation, because it will bring investments in infrastructure in the city and social benefit. And cities can do that in different ways. They can incentivize the deployment of public charging infrastructure, deployment of chargers at individual houses or multi-unit dwellings, like with incentives or changes in their civil codes, and they can prescribe targets and support electrification of public transportation. And public transportation can be different ways. It could be a fleet of ride-sharing services, or it can be school buses and transit buses, and service fleets. All those segments, solutions for electrifications are there. The upfront cost might be higher. It is higher, but in the long run, the total cost of ownership is already in many instances competitive to traditional, diesel or gas-fueled vehicles. And it gives cities the opportunity to really make a step forward in, digitalization of these services. And here, the interesting thing is that certain, less advanced countries are leapfrogging in investments. And Enel has been part of very large deployments in Latin America, for instance, in Chile and in Colombia, where we've helped the transit authorities of the city of Santiago and the city of Bogota in the build out of large depots for hundreds of transit buses in a model which has been very sustainable for the finances of the city and give them, the opportunity of deploying, as I said, large fleet. We have 800 buses in Santiago, 800 buses in Bogota already, at the speed of adoption that you cannot find in any large city in North America, for instance. It's only comparable to China at this point in time, where China is the largest investor at the moment in electric public transportation, and these large vehicles require huge investments, and utilities there also have a key role because they can help deploying on-site distributed energy resources with storage and solar, and building microgrids to support this public transportation fleet. And similarly, you can do with other commercial fleet and so on. The model applies very, very much similarly to other spaces. And in some cases, these large batteries on big vehicles concentrated in single nodes on the grid, these large depots can play even a bigger role in supporting the grid. I was mentioning before how EV charging can be a flexible resource for the grid for demand response. When you start having, megawatt-size charging at large depots for commercial or public fleet, then you can start thinking not only of demand response, but even of providing additional services to the grid. I'm talking here about the difference between V1G and V2G. Those are two flavors of vehicle grid integration. So V1G is the ability of reacting to the need of the grid by reducing the charge. So it's demand response, basically. V2G is the ability to provide back energy to the grid from the battery of the vehicles to, simply providing, load shifting capabilities or even ancillary services. When you have a large concentration of batteries and power, that starts becoming an appealing value proposition and might become soon a reality, especially where you have vehicles that do not have a high utilization. With public transit, it's different because you want to have those vehicles running as many hours as possible. But school buses or trash collection vehicles that do not run 12, 14 hours a day, those are big batteries that can also serve the purpose of helping the grid, where again, utilities being part of that will be key to maximize the benefit for the grid and reducing costs for ratepayers.
Giovanni, tell us something about the exciting new technologies, because a lot of us have been reading about, road charging capability. You just drive over a road and, your car gets charged at the same time. I think some pilot projects have happened in some countries in Europe. What are the new exciting technologies like that you see emerging and that perhaps that you are working on as well?
So I think that there is experimenting in so many different ways. I think wireless charging is one thing. Battery swap is something that, is trying to get foothold again. But I think what is going to be mainstream is, having easy way of charging, whether at home or on the road, having a very simple charging experience in which you can simply connect to the vehicle and start charging, and everything is taken care of. So who is the customer that is using the charger, how to pay, if it is for pay, or how to identify the driver, if it is restricted to certain users, having a very streamlined experience and having fast charging capabilities. But it very much depends on what OEMs, EV automakers will support. So everything about adoption of technologies around charging will depend on OEMs. Take for instance, I was mentioning before V2G. V2G is something that we've been talking about and experimenting about for a long time. Enel alone has done probably 4 different pilots in different regions in Europe, but it is not something that is currently supported by automakers. There is basically only 1 or 2 vehicles on the market who can theoretically support that. So it has never, got a foothold, and you really need critical mass for something new to become mainstream. What is very interesting and exciting is that is starting to coming back as we are getting more and more vehicles, and some of those vehicles have bigger batteries, like in pickup trucks. This is something that is becoming interesting, and automakers are now looking at how can I make the battery of a vehicle a source of reliability for the house, so that instead of households buying a diesel generator to keep in their garage, they can just plug the car and power their home for 2-3 days. So there, the charger will play a critical role in integrating the car with the house, or potentially with your solar panels and your stationary battery, and playing that integrated system. That is something, Ford is doing that. We're seeing many other automakers looking at that. So that's a place where there will be a lot of benefit for household, and also an opportunity for utilities to support that business model, which will become very interesting in the next few years.
Giovanni, this is really exciting to know. You talk about different experiments which are going on, new technologies, as well as the need for bringing so many different players from the government to the utilities to automakers together. With this, I'd like to end this conversation, and I'd really like to thank you for sharing your insights and the work that you're doing.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Pranjal.
So thank you everybody for listening. I was in conversation with Giovanni Bertolino, Head of E-Mobility USA and Canada at Enel X.
Thank you for listening to #DisruptionDialogues. If you are a strategy or market intelligence professional, we invite you to join our community on LinkedIn, #DisruptionDialogues.